Hey, it's Dr. Bear, and this lecture is about slavery and the slave fundamental class process. All right, so this is continuing with the material from the previous lecture, okay, the previous lecture about class and exploitation and class analysis and so on. And this lecture, we're just going to go into a little bit more detail on one of these five fundamental class processes. And again, that is the slave fundamental class process. Okay, so to begin with, let's just provide some context on slavery as a kind of production. Uh, it's a very old one, okay? It's been practiced in many cultures throughout recorded history and probably before. All right, so existed in many cultures, many parts of the world. And of course, it's changed over time. It's taken on different forms. We have a history of slavery, for example, in ancient Egypt. Uh, it's famously described in the Torah and so forth. In the Middle East, in Africa, in Europe. A lot of our history there has to do with the Roman Empire. And of course, slavery went on decline in Europe after the Roman Empire fell. We had the rise of feudalism, and a lot of the ideology which supported feudalism, again, which I spoke about in the last lecture, was against slavery, was celebrating feudalism and the special constellation of relationships that supports that kind of class exploitation as being different and better than the slavery which was prevalent under the Roman Empire. A lot of what we know about slavery is the modern form of it. Okay, so modern slavery is something that we're talking about existing in the last 500 years. Okay, so and in order to understand it, we have to get into that history a little bit. All right. Um, Modern slavery added the horror to the horrors and brutality of slavery in antiquity a new dimension, which was the maximization of profit. Okay, so modern slavery has an interesting and complex relationship with the development of this new thing, capitalism, right? And the system of modern international trade, which supports that. The slavery and the slave trade had a huge amount to do with that, and basically created the infrastructure of modern international trade. So that's important for us to understand if we want to understand, the global economy. Okay, so the story of modern slavery begins in 1492. Okay, so there we have Columbus, who is sailing and looking for a new trade route to the east. And instead of discovering that, he discovers what he calls at the time the West Indies. All right. Um, Now it's interesting because the Columbus himself and these early explorers, conquistadors, they're sometimes called. They were highly motivated by the desire to take, to conquer, to pillage. I mean, really, one of the first things that Columbus himself did was to take slaves, right? So this is their interest, okay, in the New World was slaves. Now they also discovered that the New World had a lot of natural resources, okay? So the New World had gold and silver and a lot of natural resources, a lot of natural wealth. So everything from timber to fish to, I mean, the list goes on and on and on, right? The minerals and, there's a tremendous amount of wealth in the New World. Um, and the key problem that the Europeans, as the Europeans saw it, right, the key problem was how to extract that wealth, right? How do you extract it? You need labor, right? Labor is needed. And so this becomes a problem to be solved, the early colonists and so on, okay? So, we had colonists, and those who are coming from Europe, colonists or colonizers, you could call them, a lot of them, were motivated by the desire to have their own land, right? Which was very difficult to come by in Europe, as I mentioned in the previous lecture. A lot of restrictions on land ownership. If you did not come from the nobility in, the early 1500s, it was going to be very difficult for you to obtain land. You basically almost impossible in Europe. So the New World offered an opportunity to own land that just was not present in Europe at the time, right? So they wanted to own their own land, but they, in order to extract a lot of wealth from the Americas, you really needed labor, okay? And so the colonists, what they did is form their own, small farms and homesteads and so forth, right? So, they, in terms of the class process, a lot of these were involved in an ancient fundamental class process, right? So recall what that means. That means individual production and appropriation of surplus, right? Those same individual who is producing is also taking their own surplus and deciding where it gets distributed and so forth, okay? This is a lot better than the opportunities they had available to them, but this is not how you accumulate vast fortunes, right? Vast fortunes come from exploitation of others. They come from a mechanism of taking in large amounts of surplus labor. So how do you do that, right? You need labor for there to be surplus labor, obviously, right? And if you're just talking about your own individual production appropriation, it's quite limited, okay? Again, you might become comfortable, but you're not going to become fantastically wealthy, probably sheerly off of your own labor, right? And a lot of things could go wrong, of course. The situation here is the colonists were in a position where they could basically take the land from the indigenous population. Okay, so we have to look at that, right? The reason for that is because, okay, so relationship with the indigenous people, the indigenous population. The most important thing here is that the indigenous population, much more numerous, of course, than the colonists, but they lacked immunity to European diseases, okay, infectious diseases. So think about lacked immunity to European infectious diseases. Example, think about something like smallpox, okay? Smallpox is a devastating disease, but it's old enough, it has enough history in Europe that people who survived it and so on, right, a lot of people died from it, but the survivors developed immunity, and that made outbreaks that occurred later much less severe, right? There was inherited immunity that Europeans had and didn't even know that they had, right? They encountered the indigenous people of the New World, what was called the Americas and so forth, right? Obviously, these are not the names that the native people to the land called themselves, right? We're just lumping them all together under that heading, indigenous population, right? They did not have immunity to these diseases, and this is the thing that was the most decisive factor, most decisive single factor here, right? That this destroyed about 90%. Really astonishing, right? Of the indigenous population was a result of these diseases. Okay, so and the remaining 10% was relatively easy for the Europeans to subjugate. Okay, so made it much easier for them to conquer, right? So there's all kinds of accounts of these great empires in South America being brought to heel with very few men, so because of they just succumb to disease. Um, Now, this doesn't excuse the tremendous amount of brutality that was brought to bear on that remaining 10%, right? There was a huge amount of that, right? This was a very violent process, conquering that additional that did not necessarily want to be subjugated. Who does, right? So, not to excuse that, right? Not to make this seem like some kind of accident, which it's partly that, right? But once it was discovered that this is going on, this was then used as a kind of germ warfare. Um, and the total death toll here is horrific. It's about 130 million people perished. That is overwhelmingly these indigenous populations of the Americas. Okay, so we're talking about the entire thing here. We're talking about North, Central, and South America. Just looking at that entire thing, right? So this is by far history's largest genocide. I mean, any other, there's just no parallel to this anywhere else in history, right? This is absolutely stunning amount of violence and death here. Okay, so that's part of the historical context, right? So bringing it back to the issue of how do you get the labor that is necessary to extract the wealth from this area that has a huge amount of natural resources. Um, a lot of the indigenous population is no longer available to work, right? And those that do not, they see the brutal nature of the European treatment of them and so forth. They know the land. They're able to escape. So if you try to enslave, right? Like I said, Columbus started off by taking slaves, right? Uh, but this proves not really possible to do at scale because it's just too hard to keep them. There's too much land that they can escape to. Okay, so indigenous slaves would often escape, or again, many of them would perish. So you had that problem. I'm looking at it now from the perspective of the exploiters here. They had that problem, right? That it's still ongoing, right? How do you find the labor? Okay, so one solution was through a new thing, right? This indentured servitude, right? You agree to basically enslave yourself for a period of time. You sign a contract and you tear it and you each get half, and then you put it back together when that's the indenture part, right? So this provided a sort of short-term solution, but you had a lot of the same problems, right? There was not enough labor still, even with that new institution. What happens when the servants are freed after their 7-year term and whatever, they go toward this ancient fundamental class process. They become small farmers or herdsmen or whatever, right? So again, this doesn't really solve the labor problem. What solves it finally is uh, African slavery. Okay, so Africa had a long tradition of slavery. That's an existing institution on the continent, right? So the Europeans discovered, and they did this relatively early, right? The modern international slave trade began in about 1520 or so. Okay, with the major players here, the Portuguese, uh, the English, the Dutch, a few other, the major powers here. Okay, so major European powers um, began to trade for slaves, in this early period. Okay, and then bring the slaves to the New World. Okay, so you know, extracting slaves, often with the help of local Africans who wanted to trade for they traded slaves for things that they wanted from the Europeans, often guns, right? That's the beginning of the era where firearms begin to play a decisive role in warfare. So African slavery solved the issue, the labor issue, okay? So for one thing, the Africans themselves, um, they were immune to the diseases, to European diseases, such as smallpox and so forth, that were so devastating to these native populations. Africa, of course, is the cradle of civilization, and the infectious diseases that had affected Europe had, the Africans long had immunity to these diseases. So African slaves were initially they were indentured servants. Okay, that was the form that took, because that had already been present as an idea, as a contract, and so forth, right? But this soon became something that wasn't temporary, right? Slavery became a kind of permanent condition, right? So they formed a class of slaves, right? And this was both old, right, because slavery does have a very long history, right, but also new, because that history had been on the wane in Europe, as well as lots of other places. So here, kind of a surprise that it comes roaring back, right? And again, there's an economic reason for that, right? That is the huge amount of wealth of the New World and the need for labor to make use of that, to exploit that wealth. Okay, so about somewhere between 12 and 13 million Africans were enslaved and, taken onto slave ships and, go through this middle passage, which took several months, somewhere between 2 and 3 months and so on. Very brutal trip there, right? We had tremendous loss of life. So somewhere between 10 or 20% perished along the way. So that's somewhere between 1.2 to 2.4 million or so just did not survive the journey. So, for example, right here's this is a kind of a famous drawing, right, showing here's a slave ship and how tightly packed these slaves were in this ship, how little room they have. And again, months of this, right? 2 to 3 months of these, really just unbelievable, right? It's not surprising that many just did not survive that passage. Okay, so you had the brutality of the Middle Passage, and then you also had, most of these African slaves, about 90% of them went to the Caribbean. Okay, and the crop that they produced there, tremendous demand for this new crop, and that is sugar. All right, 90% or so went to the Caribbean. About 10% went to the United States. And the crop that they're growing there, of course, is cotton. A little bit of sugar cultivation, but not a whole lot, right? You need a very tropical environment. There's not much of that in the United States, but the Caribbean and South America, so places like Brazil, we're going to include in that, right? This is a major destination for a lot of these slaves. Okay, so between these two areas, right, that accounts for the vast majority of these African slaves. So in addition to the brutal nature of the Middle Passage, you also had these seasoning camps, as they were called. And this is a place to acculturate these newly enslaved individuals into what it meant to be a slave on a sugar plantation in the Caribbean or in Brazil, or right this. So these are also places that were extremely brutal and had a lot of losses of life, mostly due to poor conditions and to things like dysentery. right? So that's a common one, right? That due to lack of access to clean water and so forth, right? So uh, again, many thousands of people perished in the combination of these camps and the passage itself, right? Um, so you had a net of about 10 million or so slaves, uh, and about 1 million of them in the U.S. Okay, so those are our kind of our large numbers. And again, of course, there's many other instances of brutality that we could mention in addition to what I've already said, right? You violence is absolutely key to maintaining and reproducing the system of slavery, of course, right? So, you had all manner of violence that was used to enforce labor discipline. Okay, so enforce labor discipline. That is to make the slaves work hard, also to punish offenses or to deter, right, through the threat of violence, to deter the slaves from rebelling or trying to escape. Or now, nonetheless, there were slave rebellions. There were slave escapes. There were even camps and communities that consisted of largely escaped slaves. So there's a whole fascinating history there of slave resistance. Uh, but in terms of violence, right, very much part of the system. Of course, we could also mention things like rape, family separation, uh, the underdevelopment of the slaves in terms of underdevelopment, right? Lack of education, medical care, and so on and so forth, right? So, the violence inflicted by the slave catchers. I mean, the list just goes on, right? All of it extremely well documented. Uh, so, this is a incredibly violent system, right? Now, it lasts for several hundred years, okay? So begins, right, to get going in about the 1520s or so. And then, as far as a trade, right, the abolition of the slave trade occurs in 1807. So we have in Britain and the United States. So what first happens, right? The focus of the world, right? There's an abolitionist movement, um, and they see the slave trade as having like some of the worst excesses of slavery, right? So, and some slave owners and slave masters and so forth actually agree and say, yes, we shouldn't have a global slave trade anymore, and that becomes the first thing that gets abolished. So this modern slave trade lasts about 300 years, right? Um, and that's the span of time in which it does, this tremendous amount of damage, right? Um, However, the institution of slavery itself persists after that, right? So the slavery itself, there's a difference between the trade in slaves, which again is abolished in the beginning part of the 1800s, and the institution of slavery, which remains legal up until the 1830s in Britain and 1860s, 1865 to be precise, in the United States, okay, is when we get abolition through the 13th and 14th Amendments of the Constitution. Um, all right, so in this course, right, we're going to focus our attention on one, particular part of it, right, the economics of slavery, okay, and we're going to do that using class analysis, okay. So we're going to start just by saying, look, um, you know, slavery, as we think of it, okay, again, we're going to focus on the economic dimension of it, but not as a kind of determinism, right? We are going to focus on that because one must focus on something and not argue that the other factors, the culture, politics, and social dimensions and so forth, are less important somehow. No, how would we know that, right? We're not making that argument. We're just choosing an area of focus, happens to be economic, because this is, economics course and so forth, right? Okay, we want to avoid the tendency of doing an economic determinism, arguing that these economic forces are somehow more important. So we want to notice that slavery has both a class structure, okay, and what do we mean by that when we're talking about class? We mean the constellation of relationships which supports a certain manner of production, appropriation, and distribution of surplus, right? So class, right? Class process, production, appropriation of surplus. Okay, I just wrote as surplus. Okay, and it also has what we could call a non-class structure. Okay, a class and a non-class structure. Okay, so class structure, like I said, this is all relative to surplus. Non-class structure is, well, what are the things which support that? What are the processes in society? And many of these function at a more macro level, right? That support the slave fundamental class process, allow it to exist, allow it to continue to exist, right? So let's start with that, right? Let's start with the non-class structure of the slave fundamental class process. Okay, so this means, right, all of the, the social, political, economic, natural processes which together provide the conditions of existence, allow for the existence, in other words, of the slave fundamental class process, right? This kind of organization of production, okay, which is uniquely slavery as opposed to other things, okay? So in the key things, in my view, right, looking at this from a historical perspective, that create the ownership of human beings, okay? Right? Now, as a technical note, this ownership may take different forms, okay? So, like I mentioned before, it could be either the person themselves that is owned, or it could be the person's labor power. Okay, the person or the person's labor power. What constitutes that, right? Along with the objectification, right? These things often go hand in hand, right? To say the person is now an object which may be used in a manner that a tool or machine, right, is that person is an object, something which could advance a person's needs or desires, right? Not a person themselves, or not. It's not necessary for us to consider their feelings or desires or whatever like we would with a person, right? That's what we mean by objectification, okay? Ownership of human beings, objectification of those human beings, which then allows the class structure to take place, right? Which allows the slave then performs necessary labor, surplus labor, and their master then appropriates the entire product of that labor and grants to the slave a master's provision. Okay, as we discussed previously, right? What does this master's provision consist of? Well, this consists of the food and clothing and shelter and, other needs which are necessary if we want a slave to continue to exist as a person, to not perish. And of course, all right, so this is determined by a number of different factors. We're using the term P to refer to that provision, okay? So the set of, right, just to review, right, the set of social and political and economic and natural processes which create the ownership of human beings, the objectification of those human beings so that we then support and reproduce the slave performing necessary and surplus labor, delivering that entire product, which is then owned by their master, who then returns to the slaves a master's provision, okay? So the non-class structure which supports the class structure, all right? So let's talk about these elements of the non-class structure, okay? So what do we mean by the political processes here, okay? We mean a combination of different things, right? We mean laws that support the slave fundamental class process, okay? So the slave FCP or the SFCP, just our terminology here, okay? So that support this particular kind of production and appropriation of surplus. The very important property rights exist, violations of property rights, they have to be defended, right? You have you need enforcement, you need punishment, you need deterrence. There's a whole collection of different political conditions of existence which are necessary here. Everything from slave catchers to various kinds of enforcers, and military and so forth in the case of uprisings, right? So all of this involved political processes, the exercise of power, okay? Political processes often extend to things like segregation, anti-mixing, so-called anti-miscegenation laws. We have a set of laws that, of course, restricts voting, right? Slaves cannot vote. Yet they're also counted in terms of representation. This is the infamous 3/5 compromise in American history, right, where the slaves are considered part of the population for purposes of representation, but do not actually vote. And the compromise there is that each slave is considered only 3/5 of a person, right? So this is a way of trying to bridge the gap, right, the contradiction between voting based on the notion that all men are created equal and everyone should have a vote, and then at the other hand, enslavement, which of course is the opposite of equality. All right, so, and then of course a set of social processes or a set of cultural processes which exist to, again, produce and reproduce the slave fundamental class process, right? So we might have here, for example, art and books, music, theater even, etc., right? All kinds of different cultural products which support and celebrate slavery as an institution, okay? So obviously that creates a culture where people say, oh yes, slavery is very much part of who we are here, This is our identity, and we, look at all of these this is a wonderful way of organizing society, right? Now, if you're going to produce that, you might have to also pay for it, right? I mean, how does all this get paid for? You have to support, if you want to have theater productions which say how wonderful slavery is, of which there were many, by the way, in the antebellum period in American history, you have to support the theater, right? You have to actually go to the theater, you have to donate to the theater, you have to, etc., right? So this is our focus, right? Economically, it's like, how does all this stuff get paid for, right? So a lot of these political processes are done by the state or the government, but not all of them, right? State, of course, is supported through taxes. In general, they have other means, but that's the large one, right? So again, we're looking at now how does this constellation of forces which supports the production and appropriation of surplus, how does that get created, and how does it continue to exist over time? Okay, you might need a certain kind of theology, right? You might want your view of religion, right, to say, okay, look, slavery is very much consistent with the dominant religion at the time, right, which is Christianity. And this effort was made, right? And again, if you want this kind of theology, you have to pay for, right? You have to support the church. You have to give money to the church and so forth. And by the way, just we're not going to get too far into this, but this is a new interpretation of Christianity, which is quite different from the message that existed under feudalism, right? But taking the theology of the feudal era and adding this new dimension to it, a white supremacist interpretation, right? To say that the slaves represent the children of Cain. Okay, so the biblical story of Cain and Abel, and this was the Christian way to support slavery. Now, of course, there's lots and lots of instances of slavery described in the Bible, right? Because again, the Roman Empire and the slavery was a prevalent and well-known institution at the time, right? So there's lots of scriptural examples of slavery. The Old Testament gives different punishments, the disobedient daughter and sell her into slavery and so forth, right? But what the effort here is to say slavery is very, very much supported by the Christian faith, and is a key part of that. Getting rid of it would be non-Christian, would be against Christianity, okay? Along with this, we have the notion, for example, of the white man's burden, right? To say, this is the responsibility of whites as the superior race, is to civilize and uplift and so forth, right? This is very much part of American history, especially U.S. history, right? But we see this everywhere that slavery was promulgated in the New World. Okay, so, and I hope this makes it clear that the creation and spread of the racist ideology that I'm referring to is not somehow an accident or whatever, right? It has a very key role to play, which is that it supports this slave fundamental class process, right? So that is its economic function, right? And this is not to say that the people who created this stuff didn't believe it or whatever, right? I'm sure they did, but we're just focusing on how does this work? How does it support the slave fundamental class process? Okay. Now things are always contradictory. Okay, so whatever supports the creation of something may at the same exact time also undermine it, right? And so we find various different attacks on this, right? Not everyone is satisfied with this view of Christianity, and many point out, no, this is not consistent at all with how I understand it be with Christianity, right? So there's not uniform agreement on this, just like there's not about anything, right? But the point is, right, we're talking about things which support the institution of slavery, but are not themselves directly related to the production and appropriation of surplus, right? They are the conditions of existence for that, right? So, right, that's what all this whole non-class process phrase is used, the conditions of existence, okay, for the slave fundamental class process. Okay, so we can look at economic processes. We can note, for example, that in the United States, there was a certain division of labor in slave production, right? Most of it is agricultural. Most of it is focused on growing cotton. This is called the gang labor system. The way that the labor process was organized was required a group of slaves working together, right? So in planting, for example, you had a kind of an assembly line, all right? Right? This is an attempt to use division of labor and specialization, apply that to agriculture, and to create efficiency in terms of planting and harvesting, because cotton is a very labor-intensive crop, right? So the gang labor system allows this, right, assembly line kind of process, and what that does is it means that the larger plantations, actually have an efficiency gain, right? They have the greater efficiency, meaning they can produce they can produce cotton at a lower cost per unit. Okay, so decrease the cost per unit of the cotton, right? And of course, what this means is that the larger plantations, since they have greater efficiency, lower cost per unit, they have an advantage in the market, right? Advantage over these small producers. Okay, so that affects, right, how slavery developed as an institution in the United States, right? The slave fundamental class process is more efficient on a larger plantation so that we can employ the division of labor of the gang labor system, okay? Now, of course, you also require slave markets. That's an economic process. Slave markets are necessary in order to preserve and continue the institution of slavery itself. You also need a certain kind of foreign trade policy, tariff policy, which markets are open to slavery, and so forth, right? So economic policies which support the institution of slavery. And we could also talk about, for example, natural processes, which I'll go into this, right? So concerned with biological or physical elements of reality. So, like, for example, one of these natural processes I mentioned, right, the Africans' immune conditions, okay, so immune to European diseases. Not all diseases, but you get the idea, right? That Africans tend to be visually different from Europeans, and this was seized on to create, a racist ideology, which said that the differences in appearance also correlated with other differences, right? In you name it. I mean, this became a very, very detailed ideology. Everything from intelligence to hard workingness and so forth, and it just goes on and on, right? Because this ideology of racism, or to be more accurate, it's really white supremacy, has been developed over a process of hundreds of years, right? And it always tries to connect itself back to natural or biological things which are said to be unchangeable, right? And this is, again, part of the ideology of slavery that says, because these biological features exist, then of course we need the institution of slavery, right? Because that exists, right? So now, of course, that's very much logically flawed, right? But the point is just that we are adopting a certain interpretation of this, right? That what does it mean that there's tends to be a visual difference between African and European? By the way, this is not 100% true, right? None of this stuff is. We're talking about tendencies, or for example, that Africans, greater skin melanin content, which then was interpreted to mean they can work in the sun with fewer consequences. And I mean, just again, it goes on and on in terms of the development of this ideology. Okay, so the point from our perspective is, right, we have social, economic, political, natural processes, all of these forming a non-class structure, which then supports the production and appropriation of surplus. So let's turn our attention next to that class structure itself, right? The production and appropriation of surplus itself, okay? So a lot of this is focused on commodity production, okay? So commodity production means we are producing goods and services for the purpose of selling them, right? So we're gonna do an example and use some of the value categories that we've created here, right? Commodity production is not unique to the capitalist fundamental class process, okay? So any class process can produce commodities, right? So we have our 5 fundamental class processes, right? We have the feudal, slave, ancient, capitalist, and communal fundamental class processes. Any of these could produce commodities or not, right? Now, historically, as we mentioned, right, the feudal fundamental class process, we often did not see commodity production in agriculture. Most of the production and appropriation, especially in its initial phases when the corvée labor system was still strong, still in place, right? The serfs were not, by and large, producing for the market. That changes over time, right? A lot of slaves are also not producing commodities for the market, right? So they may or they may not. It just depends on the situation, the context that we're analyzing, right? So ancient fundamental class process, again, lots of examples of individuals producing commodities for the market. Sometimes they don't, right? Sometimes they use the products themselves. Capitalist, of course, that one's very much inseparable. We don't have instances of capitalism that don't produce for the market, but communal fundamental class process, again, any one of these can produce commodities, okay? So we're going to analyze slavery, the slave fundamental class process, as a form of commodity production because that's what it was in the modern era, right? We have the cash crop system. We have the production of crops in agriculture, which is where most slaves were producing, but not all, okay? So we'll get into some that did not produce commodities. Let's say, just as an example, okay? Let's say we're looking at a sugar plantation in, let's say, Barbados. Here's an example of what such a thing looked like, right? Here's the sugar cane, okay? And you have these slaves here, they're harvesting it, right? And this is going to be produced as it's a product, right? So here's the raw cane through processing and so forth. Here's an overseer. Okay, you can see they have a little different appearance, right? They got a stick, and they're not working, but rather overseeing the work. Okay, this is probably another overseer right over here. All right, so back to our example, right? Let's say that there's 100 slaves, and these 100 slaves over the course of 1 year produce, let's say, $5 million in sugar. Okay, and let's say that they use a total of $500,000, so $500,000, right? $0.5 million, and that is in raw materials and the depreciation on their tools and equipment, etc. Right, all of that. Okay, so in other words, all of this is C, right? That's constant capital. Okay, like I discussed in the labor theory of value video or the class analysis video. Okay, so constant capital, labor produces value, but not on its own, right? It produces value typically with other things. Okay, some of those things are natural resources. Some of them are the products of past labor, right? Typically, again, we look at labor theory of value, looks at the labor that's been embodied in other things, okay? So if we need, for example, we're harvesting sugar, we need knives, right, to cut the cane. We need, wheelbarrows and wagons in order to transport it, etc., right? There's a variety of different agricultural tools and equipment. It lasts perhaps longer than that 1 year, but just the portion of it that is used up in that year, along with the raw materials that are used up, etc., this is the constant capital, okay? So we're saying, imagine that it's $500,000, okay? Now, the slaves receive a master's provision, right? So remember, this master's provision, let's just talk about this, okay? We're calling that P, master's provision. And what it means is the food, clothing, shelter, and other stuff, right, whatever is seen as necessary to reproduce the slave's labor power, to allow them to continue to exist, whatever is seen as necessary. I mean, for example, food, clothing, shelter, they might receive something like rum, right? A common part of slaves' rations. Do you need that in order to live? No, right? You don't need to get drunk in order to live, but you might give that out anyway, right? Because I mean, maybe it's a special thing, maybe it's a reward, or maybe each slave receives a certain ration of this and whatever. Just an example, right? The point is that the master is the one who decides what the slave gets. They don't have any control over this, and that is consistent with the ownership relationship, the objectification, right? You're given your sustenance by somebody else who decides what the extent of it is, right? So now there's always cost to this, right? I mean, if you're going to have 100 slaves, that's not free. It might look free, right? Marx says the labor of the slave appears to be free. It's not, though, right? Because all of this has costs associated with it, right? I mean, food, clothing, shelter, etc. It's not free. Let's say that over the course of a year, the total of this master's provision is $2 million. Again, there's 100 of them, right there. So you could try to reduce the expenditure as much as possible if you wanted, right? We've talked about it's possible that the master's provision could be less than the value of the labor power, right? So V is the value of labor power, okay? And it corresponds to what is seen as the necessary labor, okay? Now, given that slavery is just very different, and that the slave is seen as a different kind of person, inferior type of person, right? That's a racist ideology that supports this. It might be that what is seen as necessary for slaves is less than what is seen as necessary for everybody else, right? But, we could make an argument for that, okay? The point is, we could put a little subscript here, okay, a V subscript S, just to remind us that this is the value of the slave labor power, right? That's different. There's not a market for labor power here, right? The slave master does not purchase the slave's labor power on the open market. That's capitalism, right? That's a capital fundamental class process. What the slave master purchases is the slave, right? But there's still a value of labor power, right? There's still a sense of what is necessary to sustain a slave, at whatever is considered the socially acceptable level, okay? So now the master's provision could be less than that. I mean, they're well within their rights to do that. Or it could be equal to, okay? Okay, so the master's provision could be less than the value of the slave labor power, okay? Could be equal to, or it could even be greater, right? Now, of course, economic forces intervene here, which is that if you have a master's provision that's much less than this, it could be a little bit less, maybe you get away with that, but if it's much less than that, I mean, there is a biological necessity here, right? You don't need to give them rum biologically, but you do need to give them a certain amount of calories, right? They need clothing and shelter, otherwise they're going to die. And given that they have an economic value, right, given that you own the slave's person or you own their labor power, right, given that they have an economic value, it might not make economic sense to give a master's provision that's less than the value of the slave labor power, right? So, and people pointed this out over time. They said, look, the slave owners are business people, and it makes as little sense to do this as it does to not oil your machine properly or whatever, right? It's an expensive machine. You might as well take care of it. Okay, so, and that's a kind of brutal calculus right there, right? But it's to say, look, this is likely to be less prevalent than we might think, right? It's likely that, right, given that the slaves have value and so forth, the master's provision is probably going to be somewhere around the value of the slave labor power. Not that this is impossible, and by the way, this isn't impossible either. Maybe you give them rewards in addition to what is considered necessary. Also possible. Okay, so I'm not saying it has to correspond with any of these, right? It could It could vary, and of course it depends on that individual policy of that particular slave owner, right? Uh, okay, so the point is, right, they receive a master's provision which has cost, okay? Um, the labor of the slaves is not free. All right, so then we can say, okay, they produce the sum of value, right? The value of the sugar that they produced is equal to the C plus the value of the slave's labor power, right? I mean, we are assuming for now that that's equal to the master's provision. And then the remaining is surplus, okay? So the value produced by slaves, the constant capital went into that slave fundamental class process, the value of the slave's labor power, and then a slave surplus, okay? And we can break this down into its components, right? Because we've already established that constant capital is 0.5. The master's provision cost the master $2 million. And so that adds up to 2.5 right there, right? So this is C plus V, okay, in our example, 2.5. And since the value of the entire thing is 5, that leaves us a remaining 2.5. Okay, so again, this is in millions of dollars, right? $5 million is the value of the final product of sugar, okay? And so the surplus, right, 2.5 million in this example. Okay, we can go on and look at, well, what is the rate of exploitation, okay, or the value rate of exploitation, or the rate of surplus value, okay, that's S over V. So our S here is 2.5, and our V is 2, a rate of exploitation of 1.25, okay? We can also look at the value rate of profit. And that is S over C plus V. Okay, so we've got 2.5 over 2.5. We've got a value rate of profit of 1. Now let's go back to the rate of exploitation for a moment. It might be interesting to compare this to, since this historical form of slavery also exists side by side next to capitalism, it might be interesting to compare what is the rate of exploitation relative to capitalism, right? Is slavery a more exploitative form of class exploitation, or is it less? Both are interesting, right? I mean, that it's more exploitative, yeah, I mean, that's kind of what we expect, right? But wouldn't it be interesting if it was less? I mean, that would be interesting too, right? That's the point of constructing a rate of exploitation, right? It allows us to see how intense is the expropriation of surplus relative to what the producer receives, okay? Okay, so the value rate of profit, right, this looks at how large is the gross surplus relative to the cost of production, the C plus V. And then we could look at the organic composition of capital. Okay, and this allows us to construct a notion of how capital intensive in terms of the C, right? This is C over C plus V. Okay, so we have here a 0.5 over 2.5, all in millions, gives us, oh, I'm sorry, this is 0.5 over 4.5. Okay, so that gives us a 1/9 or 0.11. Okay, and this allows us to see, well, this is not a capital intensive type of industry, right? Agriculture tends to be a lot less use of capital than manufacturing. Okay, and then we have appropriation of surplus. Okay, so we already covered this, right? But the appropriation is the slave owner. Okay, the slave owner owns the entire product that the slaves produce. Now, this is the same as under capitalism, right? The owner of the factory owns the entire products that the entirety of the product that the capitalist worker produces as well, right? So that part is the same, right? It's just that the relationships around that production appropriation are different. That's what makes the slave fundamental class process different from the capitalist fundamental class process. So the next thing would be to look at, well, what are the processes which are subsumed to that? Okay, I talked about some of them, right? We have conditions of existence for the slave fundamental class process to exist. Um, but we might also want to look at the revenue and the expenditure of the, the slave owner or of the slave enterprise, right? So because what I've sketched out, right, is an enterprise, okay? This plantation that produces a particular crop, right, sugar, at a particular place in a particular time. Let's say that we can categorize their revenue, okay? Now it's common to look at the revenue and expenditure of firms, right? What's uncommon is to do that revenue expenditure in class terms. Okay, so we can look at the flows of value and whatever, right? But if we're doing class theory, then we need those flows of value to be relative to the class process, right? That is being consistent with our analysis, right? If class is our analytical framework, then that is our way of categorizing every flow of value, right? We say, is that flow of value that is received in revenue, is it, for example, surplus, right? So a slave surplus, we already talked about that, right? In our example, it's 2.5 million, right? And these revenues, if it's a slave surplus, there is what we could call a subsumed class payment that is necessary to secure that. Okay, so SSCC stands for subsumed class payment. Okay, now in theory, just like a counting kind of framework, right? In theory, these two would be equal, right? The surplus that is received is equal to the sum of subsumed class payments, which is necessary to secure that, okay? So let's break that down, right? Let's say what is included in this subsumed class process, okay? So we might, for example, need managers. Managers. Well, that's kind of the capitalist term for it, isn't it? Right? Managers. In slavery, these are called overseers, or sometimes they're called drivers, slave drivers. Right? They're the managers. So what do? Right? They oversee the production process and they ensure that their labor is disciplined. Right? How do they do that? Like this. Whoosh, right? They crack the whip, literally, I mean, it's crazy that we still use that phrase, like somebody who's overseeing you, even if they're not literally whipping you, they're just providing accountability or whatever our modern term is. We might still say, wow, you're really cracking the whip. So interesting way of, dealing with our history here. It's the managers, the overseers, the slave drivers under the slave class process, of course, they actually do have whips, and often they have guns, right, to enforce, right, to make sure that the slaves don't run away, that they work, right. If they're not working fast enough, then they get a flick of the whip, right. Now you don't want to injure the slave, you don't want to whip them so badly that they can't work. So that's what the overseer does, right. They provide enough of fear, right, to get the slaves to work at a high level of effort, right? Now, of course, they're not working themselves, right? How do you pay them? Well, the the now look, a lot of the history here is that a lot of the slaves who were overseers themselves, right? Um, the slaves were often that's where they get the labor for the overseeing. Okay, so here's an example, right? I showed you this guy, right? So a person of African descent on a slave plantation like this, right, is a slave. Okay, um, these are slave overseers, right? So they are not performing necessary and surplus labor. They're not cutting any cane themselves, right? They are ensuring the conditions of existence for the slavery to continue. And they have to be paid out of the surplus. Now, does that mean they're paid money? Maybe not, right? They get food, clothing, shelter, etc. They might get slightly better clothes, right? Because something has to set them aside, right? See how these guys have fancier clothes? They might get better shoes, or maybe they get shoes at all, right? Or this look, he's got a fancy European style top hat here, So this all comes from the surplus, right? Um, Now, here's other examples. Okay, so uh, this is a different kind of whipping that we're seeing right here, right? This is whipping for some kind of offense, right? Maybe it's an attempt to run away or do some, it's some kind of infraction, right? Now here, look who's doing the whipping, right? This is another slave, right? And then here's a white person over here, right, who's watching the whole thing, but they're injured. They can't really hit. They can't use the whip, right? So this slave overseer whips this slave, right? Wow. Okay, that's again. This is part of the system. Very well established part of the system. Okay, in order to get this to happen, a portion of the surplus needs to be allocated to the slave driver, the slave overseer. Now, is this slave going to be injured from this and make him less able to work? Yeah, probably. These are brutal affairs, whippings, right? Here's the kind of consequence that emerges from that, right? Look at this crisscrossing of horrible scars, right? I mean, if your back gets cut open like that, are you working in the field the next day? No. It's going to take you some time to recover, right? So you can't do this that often, but if you are going to do it, you make sure it's a spectacle. That is, everyone else sees it. See this, right? Look, here's a child hiding from the brutality of it. You make sure everyone sees it because that's how it functions as deterrence, right? Here's what happens if you do the thing that you're not supposed to do, right? Whether it's run away or maybe it's not work hard enough. Somebody has to be made an example of. Okay. Okay. So here's another example of slave overseers. All right, this one's armed, and they're overseeing the production process here. Now you're also going to need some of the surplus, which is you could call this like caring labor, right? So what does this mean? Well, we need child rearing, we need these various different kinds of care, right? So you need some medical care, right? You need this which allows the slave population to survive and even expand, right? I mean, slaves have children which are then born into slavery. Somebody needs to watch these children, right? Until they're old enough to work. That requires some labor. That's a distribution of surplus, right? That's an expenditure which is necessary to secure the surplus itself, right? If you don't provide that labor, well, you could just not provide it, but that means you're going to have to then purchase more slaves, right? So that's another distribution of surplus. Okay, some of the slaves are going to perish, either through old age or because of overwork or because whatever things happen, right? Maybe some of them die from their injuries, from being whipped and so forth, right? You're going to have to take some of the surplus and use it to purchase slaves. Okay. You are going to have to take some of the surplus and reinvest it if you want to produce a growth in the slave plantation itself, right? You are going to have to take some of that surplus, spend it on taxes, which allow the state to provide all of its conditions of existence and so forth, right? You might need to take some of the surplus and spend it on conspicuous consumption. Okay. Conspicuous consumption, that is having a big fancy plantation house and having servants who wait on you and whatever. I mean, this is all part of establishing that the whites are the dominant race and so forth, right? Conspicuous consumption, it's a spectacle, it's intimidating, right? It's like, oh, you're going to see this plantation owner and look at the grandeur that they live in and whatever, right? So you need to take a portion of the surplus and spend it on that as a way of securing those conditions of existence, okay? Now, some of the surplus goes to other sources, which I don't have space to mention here, right? Some of it is going to need to go to merchants who take a cut of the surplus in order to sell the product, right? Some of it is going to go to refiners because, I haven't mentioned all of the different steps in the process, right? the refining of sugar into its finished form, right, which is that white powder, right? That's not what gets grown on a sugar plantation. What gets grown on a sugar plantation is sugar cane, which then needs to be pressed into a juice, which then needs to be the water from that juice evaporated, and then it goes through a refinement process and so forth, right? So, part of the surplus is spent to refine the product, unless you're selling raw sugar cane, which some did, right? So these are all distributions of surplus which go to supporting, to allowing the surplus as revenue to exist, okay? Now, some of it goes to slave catchers and different things. Okay, so this is a couple of examples, right? Now, there may also be subsumed class revenue. Okay, so subsumed class revenue. Right, so that is, there may be revenues which the plantation gets which are due to their position supplying the conditions of existence for the slave fundamental class process. Okay, so example, some plantations did this, right? They would rent their slaves to others. Okay, so yeah, there's actually a significant market for slaves not to buy, but to rent. Okay, now who are you renting them from, right? You're renting them from their owner, right? So, and what are you purchasing if you rent a slave? Well, you're buying their labor power, right? You don't own it, but you have bought it for that, let's say that day. Usually it's by the day, right? So a slave owner who is allowing their slave to be rented by others is doing this, right? They're getting a subsumed class revenue. They're not getting surplus from that because the slave is not producing anything for them, right? Slave is producing for somebody else. But they are getting a revenue, they're getting money, right? And that's a subsumed class revenue, okay? If the slave then goes to produce elsewhere as a fundamental class process, okay? So if that slave doesn't produce anything and is just rented for I don't know what purpose, right? Then they get what you'd call a non-class revenue. Okay, so we've got subsumed revenue and we've got a non-class revenue. Okay, now it may be the same activity, renting slaves, but it's a different, whether it's subsumed or non-class, depends on, well, what are the slaves then doing, right? Are they involved in the fundamental class process or are they doing something else? Okay, so, right, and there's costs associated with this, okay? So if you have costs associated with the subsumed class revenue, we'll just call that X, okay? So cost of obtaining the subsumed class revenue, and the same thing, right, to obtain the non-class revenue, okay? So we've got a revenue and expenditure list here, okay, that shows all the different elements of the revenue and all the different expenditures categorized in class terms, okay? That's very important, right? So other examples, right, I talked about the slave rental market. We might look at, there are some plantations where they actually don't do any agriculture. They just do, for example, slave breeding, right? Fairly horrible, but you get the idea there, right? All they do is produce new slaves for the market, right? Some specialized in this, right? So how do they make money? Well, they make money by, producing slaves, which they then sell, right? That gives them a non-class revenue, okay? They don't get surplus from that because they're not producing a commodity, right? They're not producing a crop. They themselves are the commodity, so they get a non-class, subsumed class or a non-class revenue from that, depending on what then happens to the slave, right? Some plantation owners might receive interest from loans that they make, right? They loan money to another plantation, let's say, right? I've had a disaster. The slave rose up and they burned down, one of my buildings, and I was able to subdue them and kill a bunch of them. but now I'm going to be broke. Can I borrow some money? I'll pay you back with interest. Okay, so then if you do that, then you receive revenue from that, okay, as that would be a subsumed class revenue in that case, okay. If you loan to somebody else who's not a slave plantation owner, it would be a non-class revenue. Okay, so the same activity, depending on who it goes to, for what is its relationship to, again, we're all trying to do all this in class terms. So what's the relationship to the surplus, okay? Is it directly producing that? Okay, then it's a subsumed class payment. Is it indirect? Is it designed to produce a subsumed class revenue? Okay, that's that, right? Is it designed to produce a non-class revenue? All right, so we want to categorize everything in terms of the surplus, right? That's what a class analysis means. If we want to be logically consistent, and we put it at the forefront. Okay? So from this analysis, we can kind of see, look, slavery as an institution, okay, that is, if your person or your labor power is owned, then you are enslaved, okay? That puts you in here, right? Now, are you also then doing a form of production? Are you producing something for the market? Maybe not, right? You might, so a subset of this group is doing the slave fundamental class process, but some of those enslaved are subsumed, right? They are a subsumed class process, right? So example I mentioned before, the overseers, okay? Or we could look at, for example, the domestic workers, okay? They are not necessarily producing value or producing commodities, but they're providing conditions of existence for that, okay? Or the caring labor that I mentioned that, reproduces the slave labor force, right? So you might be doing some kind of subsumed class process, or maybe it's a fundamental class process right there. You might be working in the field. And what we can see is there's a lot of, divisions that are created here between these different groups, right? So example, the house slaves versus the field slaves versus the overseers, right? These become different classes within the enslaved, right? These are all slaves, but they have very different class positions, right? The overseer is a manager and is a subsumed class, right? The field slave is doing the fundamental class process, right? Now, house slaves may also be doing a fundamental class process. They might just not be producing a commodity, but they're still producing, goods and services that have value and so forth. But anyway, the point is, there is very often cultural differences and conflicts that emerge, right? The house slaves and the field slaves they see themselves as different, right? Because the domestic servant type of slaves, they are selected often because they are light skinned, uh, or because they are seen as trainable, and so they are given training in European manners and speech, which then marks them as different. They are told that they're better than the, field slaves and so forth. The overseers are also told that they're different and better. And so all of this has a purpose in mind, right? That is to divide the class of slaves into, subclasses, which then are in conflict and competition with one another, right? Very, very important in terms of maintaining the whole system of exploitation. Okay, so that's a look at the economics and some of the history of slavery. Thank you very much.